1867 Does Capital, Volume I, Critique of Political Economy. 1867 Does Capital, Volume I, Critique of Political Economy is one of the most influential works ever written about modern society. Karl Marx published this volume in 1867 after spending decades studying factories, wages machines, and the real experiences of everyday workers. His mission was not simply to write a book about economics. He wanted to expose the hidden forces that shape human life under capitalism. Why did Marx write this book? Because he believed that something was deeply wrong with a system where the people who actually create value, workers, remained poor, while those who owned factories and money grew richer without doing the labor themselves. He wanted to uncover how this system worked beneath the surface, the laws that govern profit, wages, exploitation, and social inequality. What makes this book powerful is not just the analysis, it is the suspense Marx builds as he reveals layer after layer of the capitalist machine. He begins with something simple, the commodity, and shows how an entire world of profit and exploitation is secretly built inside it. He takes readers from the workshop floor to the counting room, from the sweat of labor to the cold logic of capital. This three-chapter condensed version captures the essence of Marx's Volume I. It is designed for listeners and readers of all backgrounds, from curious beginners to experts seeking clarity. The style is simple, vivid, and engaging, making it ideal for storytelling, teaching, or creating audio narrations. By the end, you will understand not only how capitalism works, but why Marx believed it carries the seeds of its own transformation. Chapter 1. The Birth of Capitalism, Commodities, Labor, and the Hidden Mechanics of Value. When Karl Marx opens Does Capital, he does not begin with kings, wars, or political speeches. He begins with something far smaller, a commodity, a simple object sold in a marketplace. At first, this feels almost anticlimactic. Why start a revolutionary book with such an ordinary thing? But this is where Marx's brilliance shows itself. He knew that inside the commodity, inside that ordinary, everyday object, lies the entire architecture of capitalism. If you understand what a commodity is, why it has value, and how that value is created, you begin to understand the hidden machinery of modern economic life. Marx begins small because the secret of the entire system is hidden in that smallness. Imagine holding a wooden chair made in a factory. It looks simple: wood, paint, nails, maybe a cushion. But Marx would tell you, look again. Behind that chair is a story of forests cut down by lumber workers, machines built by engineers, factory owner investing money, workers being paid wages, and those same workers producing more value than they're paid for. Behind the chair is the real engine of capitalism, not the marketplace, not the price tag, but labor. This chapter explores that first key message. Capitalism is built on the commodity, and the commodity is built on labor. To understand capitalism, you must understand the true nature of value, not the price you see in a shop, but the human effort hidden behind it. The commodity, ordinary on the outside, extraordinary on the inside. A commodity has two sides like a coin. Marx calls these use value and exchange value. Use value, the practical side. Use value is the simple part, what the thing can do for you. A chair lets you sit. A phone lets you communicate. A car lets you travel. You enjoy use value directly. But use value alone cannot explain capitalism. A farmer growing food for their own table creates use value, but not a commodity. A carpenter building a shelf for personal use creates use value, but not a commodity. A commodity must be produced not for personal use, but for exchange. Exchange value, the mysterious side. Exchange value is more complicated. It expresses how much of another commodity you can get in trade. For example, one coat equals 20 yards of linen. One phone equals 80 cups of coffee. 1 ounce of gold, many ordinary goods. Exchange value is not about usefulness. It is about how much labor, time, and energy society invests into producing each item. This is why diamonds cost more than bread, not because they keep you alive better, but because they require far more labor and far more difficult extraction processes. Marx argues that in order for commodities to be exchangeable, they must share something in common, not shape, not color, not material, but labor. Human labor is the universal ingredient found inside every commodity. This is the key. Behind all commodities lies socially necessary labor time, the source of value. The hidden foundation, labor as the substance of value. What does socially necessary labor time mean? Marx does not say value comes from how hard a worker tries or how tired they become. Value comes from the amount of labor time that society accepts as normal, reasonable, and efficient for producing that item under average conditions. For example, if it normally takes 2 hours to knit a scarf using common tools, the value of the scarf is based on that 2 hours of average labor time, not 10 hours of slow work or 1 hour of superhuman speed. This concept is revolutionary because it strips away illusions. Prices are not based on magic. Profit is not the result of the owner's intelligence. Wealth is not created by money alone. Value emerges from labor, real work done by real people. In capitalism, this fact is often buried under layers of price tags, advertisements, marketing tricks, and financial speculation. But for Marx, the role of labor is the central truth of the system. Every time you buy something, you are indirectly paying for the labor that created it. This means the laborer, not the owner, is the real creator of wealth. Yet paradoxically, the laborer receives the smallest share of that wealth. To understand how this happens, Marx introduces the next concept, the labor process inside capitalism. The labor process, turning nature into value. Marx breaks the labor process into 3 components. 1. Work. 2. Instruments of labor, tools, machines, technology. 3. Objects of labor, raw materials. Imagine a worker in a shoe factory. They use their hands, skills, and strength work. They use cutting machines, sewing tools, glue guns, instruments of labor. They work with leather, rubber, and thread, objects of labor. Together, these elements transform nature into useful things. But under capitalism, this simple transformation becomes something far more structured and powerful. The worker controls none of the conditions of production. They don't own the machines. They don't own the materials. They don't own the final product. They only own one thing, their ability to work, which they must sell to survive. This leads to the phenomenon that lies at the heart of capitalism, wage labor. Wage labor, the worker's strange bargain. Wage labor has a strange logic. The worker sells their labor power for a wage. On the surface, this seems fair money for work, but Marx asks us to look deeper. A worker's wage pays for food, shelter, clothing, transportation, basic needs required to keep the worker alive and ready to work again. In other words, a wage is the cost of maintaining the worker, like fuel for a machine. But here is the essential question Marx raises. Does the value the worker creates equal the wage they receive? The answer is no. If the worker received the full value of their labor, the capitalist would make no profit and the entire system would collapse. The capitalist must pay the worker less than the value they produce. This difference, the extra value created but not paid for, is called surplus value. Surplus value is the heartbeat of capitalism. It is the source of profit, the source of competition, and the source of class struggle. Although surplus value is discussed fully in Chapter 2, Marx lays the foundation here. The worker enters a system already structured so that they produce more value than they receive back. The dual character of labor, concrete labor vs. abstract labor. To uncover the hidden workings of capitalism, Marx introduces one of his most important distinctions, the dual character of labor. 1. Concrete labor. Concrete labor refers to the actual tasks a worker performs. Baking, sewing, coding, teaching, cleaning, driving. Concrete labor produces use values, the specific practical qualities of a commodity. 2. Abstract labor. Abstract labor strips away the specific differences. It refers to human labor in the abstract, time and effort measured in hours, regardless of the work's form. Abstract labor produces exchange value. This distinction is powerful because it allows Marx to explain why different commodities can be compared and exchanged. A coat and a loaf of bread have nothing in common physically, but both represent a certain amount of human labor time, and that shared essence allows them to be exchanged in the market. Thus, labor creates use value through concrete labor, exchange value through abstract labor. This is how the commodity becomes the basic cell of capitalist society. It contains both usefulness and exchangeability, both physical reality and social meaning. Commodity fetishism, when social relations disappear into objects. One of Marx's most famous and poetic ideas is commodity fetishism. The term fetishism might sound unusual, but Marx borrows it from anthropology, where a fetish refers to an object believed to have supernatural powers. In capitalism, commodities appear to have lives of their own. Prices rise and fall mysteriously. Markets behave like natural forces, unpredictable, uncontrollable. People say, the market decided. Prices set themselves. Supply and demand drive the economy. But Marx argues this is an illusion. These forces are not natural laws like gravity. They are human relationships disguised as relationships between things. What is really happening? Human labor and social cooperation create value. Human decisions shape production. Human exploitation generates profit. But the system hides this behind the movement of commodities and money. Commodity fetishism makes us believe the value of objects comes from the objects themselves. The market is a natural phenomenon. Wealth is created by capital, not labor. In reality, value comes from human work. Markets are structured by human rules. Wealth comes from unpaid labor, surplus value. Commodity fetishism is one of Marx's most powerful insights because it explains why exploitation under capitalism is often invisible. Workers feel free because they sign contracts. Capitalists feel justified because they risked capital. Consumers feel normal buying products without thinking about the labor behind them. But underneath these appearances is a deep social structure that shapes everything we do. The birth of capitalism, from simple exchange to capital. So how did this complex system arise? Marx distinguishes between two kinds of exchange. One, simple commodity exchange, CMC. Commodity right arrow money right arrow commodity. Example, a craftsperson sells shoes to buy food. Here, money is just a medium to help someone get what they need. 2, capitalist exchange, MCM. Money right arrow commodity right arrow more money. Example, an investor buys production materials and labor to sell commodities for a profit. This is where capitalism begins. In simple exchange, people sell in order to buy. In capitalist exchange, people buy in order to sell. The goal is not to satisfy needs, but to increase money endlessly. M becomes M, money grows, multiplies, expands itself. This self-expansion of money is not magic. It comes from the process we explored earlier, from the worker producing more value than they are paid. This is the birth of capital, money transformed into a mechanism for extracting surplus value through the exploitation of labor. Machines' productivity and the changing shape of labor. As capitalism develops, machines play a central role. Marx is one of the earliest thinkers to analyze how technology changes labor itself. He argues machines do not simply make work easier, they also increase the productive power of labor, reduce the worker's control, intensify the pace of work, allow the capitalist to replace skilled labor with cheaper labor. Machines embody previous labor, but they also become tools for extracting more surplus value. Over time, factories become so efficient that workers seem almost like appendages of the machines. This leads to longer working hours, faster production, a race to the bottom in wages, greater dependence on the capitalist for survival. Technology, instead of freeing workers, becomes a tool of domination, unless society changes the system that controls the technology. Capitalism's silent agreements. Marx highlights several silent agreements built into capitalism. 1, the worker must sell labor to survive. They have no alternative. 2, the capitalist must constantly seek profit. If they stop growing, they fall behind. 3, competition forces constant innovation and exploitation. Not because capitalists are greedy individuals, but because the system requires it. 4, labor produces value, but capital takes credit. Workers become invisible in the final product. 5, commodities organize social life. People relate through exchanges, not through direct social bonds. These silent agreements shape everything we consider normal in economic life. Conclusion: the hidden mechanics behind everyday life. Chapter 1 uncovers the foundations of capitalism by revealing the secrets hidden inside the commodity. Labor creates value. Capital extracts unpaid labor. Machines intensify exploitation. Commodities mask social relations. Money expands through the exploitation of labor. Marx wants readers to see that capitalism is not natural, eternal, or neutral. It is a historical system with specific rules born from specific conditions and kept alive through specific forms of exploitation. Understanding the commodity is the first step in understanding capitalism. In Chapter 2, Marx dives deeper into the heart of the system, surplus value, the engine of profit and the central mechanism of exploitation. Chapter 2. Surplus value and the engine of exploitation. If Chapter 1 reveals the hidden skeleton of capitalism, the commodity, labor, and value, then Chapter 2 reveals its beating heart, surplus value. Surplus value is the secret code that explains why workers remain poor even when they work harder, why capitalists grow wealthy even when they do not labor, and why inequality is not an accident but a built-in feature of the system. This chapter goes deep into the inner engine of capitalism, the mechanism that keeps factories running, markets overflowing, and owners obsessed with profit. Marx's idea of surplus value is not simply an economic theory. It is a lens that exposes the moral and structural logic of modern society. And once you understand it, you can never see wages, prices, or work the same way again. Let's begin where Marx begins, with the strange and fascinating commodity called labor power, the only commodity that can create more value than it costs. Labor power, the most peculiar commodity in the world. Under capitalism, the worker does not sell labor itself. Labor vanishes the moment it is performed. Instead, the worker sells labor power, the capacity to work for a certain period of time. This is the crucial distinction. Labor is an activity. Labor power is a commodity. Factories do not buy labor, they buy the right to use someone's abilities for a set number of hours. The worker agrees to show up and offer their strength, skill, focus, creativity, and time in exchange for a wage. Why, Marx asks, is labor power a commodity? Because the worker has nothing else to sell. They do not own land, factories, tools, raw materials, machines, financial capital. They own only their ability to work, and this, Marx says, is the defining mark of capitalism, the separation of workers from the means of production. The capitalist buys labor power at its value, which is determined, like any commodity, by the cost of reproducing it. Reproducing labor power means keeping the worker alive, healthy, rested, clothed, housed, and able to return tomorrow to work again. In simple terms, the wage is the cost of keeping the worker alive. But labor power has a magical property. It can create more value than the value needed to maintain it. And this difference is where surplus value is born. Necessary labor and surplus labor, the invisible split in the workday. To understand surplus value, imagine a typical 8-hour working day. Marx divides this day into two parts. One, necessary labor time. This is the time the worker needs to work just to produce value equal to their wage. For example, if the worker earns $80 a day and they produce $80 worth of value in 3 hours, then 3 hours equals necessary labor time. 2, surplus labor time. The remaining hours of the day when the worker continues working without being paid for the value they create. So the remaining 5 hours in our example are surplus labor time. The worker receives the value of 3 hours. The capitalist receives the value of all 8 hours. The extra 5 hours of unpaid labor is where surplus value comes from. This is the exploitation at the heart of capitalism. Workers produce more value than they are paid for, and capitalists appropriate the difference. This is not personal exploitation, it is structural. Even the nicest capitalist cannot escape this logic. Profit requires surplus labor. Why wages do not reveal exploitation? The beauty or the cruelty of capitalism lies in the fact that exploitation is hidden behind equal exchange. A worker voluntarily sells their labor power. A capitalist voluntarily buys it. No force, no chains, no visible coercion. Both sides leave the transaction believing it is fair. But fairness depends on what you measure. The worker is paid for the value of labor power, but they produce the value of labor itself. These two are not the same. That gap, that silent difference, is the basis of surplus value. It is why a worker can work full-time and remain poor while the owner becomes rich without ever touching a tool. The worker believes, I earn my wages. The capitalist believes, I paid the worker fairly. But the system silently ensures, The worker never receives the full value of what they produce. The capitalist never pays for the actual labor performed. Profit always equals unpaid labor. Thus, surplus value is not theft in the legal sense, but it is appropriated labor in the economic sense. Absolute surplus value, the simple, brutal method. The earliest form of surplus value extraction was simple: extend the working day. If a worker's necessary labor time is 3 hours, then a 10-hour day equals 7 hours of surplus labor. A 12-hour day equals 9 hours of surplus labor. A 15-hour day equals 12 hours of surplus labor. The formula is simple. More hours equals more surplus value. During the early days of industrial capitalism, this led to horrendous working conditions. 14 to 16-hour workdays. Little or no breaks. Dangerous machinery. Child labor. Night shifts. No safety laws. Marx documents horrifying cases. Children working until their bones softened. Women collapsing in textile mills. Workers chained to machines metaphorically by their wages. Absolute surplus value depends entirely on time. The capitalist simply squeezes more hours out of the worker. But eventually, society fought back. Workers demanded shorter hours. Governments introduced factory laws. Human bodies reached their limits. Capitalism needed a new method. Relative surplus value, the ingenious modern method. When increasing the workday became impossible or illegal, capitalism evolved. Instead of extending the hours, it intensified the productivity. This is relative surplus value produced by reducing necessary labor time through technological and organizational innovation. Let's analyze how this works. If it takes 3 hours to produce the worker's wage, the capitalist wants to reduce that time to 2 hours, 1 hour, 30 minutes. How? By increasing productivity. This is where machines, automation, scientific management, specialized tasks, conveyor belts, computerization, AI and modern algorithms all enter the picture. When productivity increases, the worker can produce their wage value sooner, and the remaining hours become surplus time. Example: worker earns $80 a day. With advanced machines, they produce $80 of value in 1 hour. They still work 8 hours. So 7 hours become surplus labor equals massive surplus value. Unlike absolute surplus value, which is limited by physical time, relative surplus value can grow indefinitely because there's no limit to technological innovation. This is why capitalism relentlessly pushes for faster machines, more efficient workflows, tighter schedules, global supply chains, cheaper inputs, continual reinvestment in production. It's not personal greed, it's systemic necessity. If one capitalist increases productivity, all must follow or face bankruptcy. Thus, capitalism becomes a system addicted to innovation, not for the sake of human progress, but for the sake of extracting more surplus value. The role of competition, a war among capitalists. Marx emphasizes that capitalists do not exploit workers because they are individual villains. They exploit because they exist in a competitive battlefield. Competition forces them to reduce costs, speed up production, lower wages, introduce new machines, reorganize labor, push workers harder, cut corners. If one capitalist discovers a way to increase surplus value by increasing productivity or lengthening work time, others must follow or die in the competition. Thus, exploitation is not a choice. It is a survival requirement. The system shapes individuals, not the other way around. In other words, even a kind capitalist must behave as a capitalist. The division of labor and the fragmented worker. To extract more surplus value, capitalism reorganizes work into tiny, repetitive tasks. This division of labor increases productivity but reduces the worker's control and creativity. In earlier societies, a craftsperson made an entire product. A blacksmith forged a sword. A tailor designed and stitched a coat. A carpenter built a full piece of furniture. Under industrial capitalism, one worker handles the cutting. Another does stitching. Another does buttoning. Another inspects. Another packs. No worker sees the full product. No worker owns their skills. No worker controls the process. This fragmentation increases efficiency, reduces training time, allows easier placement of workers, suppresses wages, destroys traditional crafts, but it massively increases relative surplus value. The worker becomes what Marx famously calls a mere appendage of the machine. Modern versions include call center scripts, barcode scanning stations, warehouse pick-and-pack systems, digital dashboards monitoring productivity, algorithm-controlled work packing. The human becomes a tool of production, not its master. Surplus value and the illusion of fairness. Many people believe wages are determined by how hard one works, skill and talent, demand in the market, education and training. But Marx flips the perspective. Wages are not compensation for the value the worker creates. They are compensation for the cost of keeping the worker alive. This is why a nurse can work 12 hours a day and earn less than a CEO who works 2 hours. A miner risks death but earns less than a gambling investor. An artist creates beauty but struggles to survive. Value in capitalism is not about morality, usefulness, or effort. It is about unpaid labor captured by capital. Thus, the idea of a fair wage is, for Marx, a contradiction. Under capitalism, wages can never be fair because they always represent only a portion of the labor's true value. The reserve army of labor, why unemployment is necessary. Marx introduces a bold idea: unemployment is not an accident, it is a requirement of capitalism. He calls the unemployed population the reserve army of labor. Why is it necessary? Because if every worker had a job, they could demand higher wages. But if there is always a pool of unemployed workers, wages stay low. Workers fear losing jobs. Capitalists maintain power. Surplus value extraction is easier. Thus, capitalism always keeps some people jobless, some underemployed, some desperate, not because the system is malfunctioning, but because it is functioning exactly as designed. The mask of neutrality, how capital appears innocent. Capital often appears neutral or even productive. A machine produces products. Money generates interest. A factory creates jobs. But Marx insists, machines and money cannot produce value. Only human labor can. So why do machines seem to create profit? Because they help extract more surplus labor. Why does money seem to grow by itself? Because it is invested in labor power, which creates surplus value. Capital is not a thing. It is a social relation, a relationship of domination where one class controls the means of production and the other must sell labor. The moral and social consequences. Surplus value is not just an economic concept, it has deep social consequences. It shapes working conditions, family life, social mobility, class structure, political power, cultural values. Because of surplus value, workers live paycheck to paycheck. Capitalists accumulate wealth without limits. Society normalizes inequality. Luxury for a few requires poverty for many. Innovation is driven not by human progress but profit. Time itself becomes a commodity. Human beings become instruments. Surplus value explains why capitalism produces both miracles and misery. Technological breakthroughs, unprecedented wealth, global networks, scientific revolutions, and simultaneously, sweatshop labor, mental stress, overwork, unemployment, extreme inequality. The same engine that drives progress also drives exploitation. Conclusion: the heart of the machine. Surplus value is the key that unlocks the logic of capitalism. Once you understand it, everything else becomes clear. Why wages stay low. Why profits grow. Why inequality expands. Why competition intensifies. Why crises erupt. Why workers struggle. Why capitalists cannot stop expanding. Why the system never rests. Surplus value is the beating heart of capitalism, the source of its energy, contradictions, and eventual instability. In Chapter 3, we explore how this engine drives capitalism towards cycles of expansion, crisis, and eventual transformation. Chapter 3, The Grammar of Belief, How Ideas Become Inner Certainties. Belief is a fascinating creature. It lives quietly inside us, rarely announcing its presence, yet directing nearly everything we do. Russell understood this deeply. Before he could dismantle Christianity or any religious worldview, he needed to examine the very machinery of belief itself. How do ideas become certainties? What is the inner chemistry that transforms assumptions into truths we hold sacred? This chapter dives into that hidden grammar. It is not about Christianity alone, but about belief as a universal human phenomenon, its beauty, its dangers, its psychological tricks, and its philosophical pitfalls. And ultimately, how we can navigate belief without surrendering our minds to illusion. 1. The architecture of inner conviction. When a person says, "I believe," they rarely mean it literally. Most beliefs are not the result of careful reasoning. They are inherited, absorbed, or emotionally anchored. Russell wanted us to recognize that convictions often masquerade as rational conclusions when they are really echoes of childhood teachings, expressions of fear or hope, social pressures disguised as intellectual insight, psychological coping mechanisms, cultural inheritance passed off as universal truth. Belief, therefore, is not simply thought. It is a blend of memory, emotion, habit, and identity. Consider how a child grows up in a religious household. Their first understanding of the world comes not from personal observation, but from authoritative voices, parents, teachers, elders. These voices do not present ideas neutrally. They frame them as unquestionable truths. By the time the child learns to think independently, the belief is already molded into their emotional foundation. Russell often compared beliefs to furniture in the mind, placed there by others long before we learned how to arrange the room ourselves. 2. The emotional roots of certainty. No belief floats in pure logic. Every belief has emotional roots. Think of someone who believes in a moral God watching over them. The belief offers comfort, meaning, protection. It satisfies a deep psychological appetite, the desire not to be alone in the universe. The emotion comes first, the reasoning is added later, like decoration over drywall. Russell argued that the dangerous part is not the belief itself, but the illusion that it is rationally justified. People often feel something strongly and then recruit logic to defend the feeling. This is what philosophers call rationalization, and it is one of the most powerful forces shaping human thought. For instance, fear of death, right arrow belief in eternal life. Fear of chaos, right arrow belief in a divine order. Fear of moral uncertainty, right arrow belief in a universal judge. These are not intellectual conclusions, they are emotional solutions. Yet to the believer, they feel like discoveries. 3. The social pressure cooker. Beliefs also have a social dimension. No one believes in isolation. Every belief is strengthened or weakened by community. Russell observed that societies reward conformity and punish deviation, especially in matters of religion. Even today, despite modern freedoms, people face real consequences for admitting uncertainty or disbelief. We inherit not just the ideas of our culture, but its emotional vocabulary. In many societies, to doubt religion is not merely a philosophical move, it is a betrayal of identity, family, and tradition. The cost of thinking differently can be emotional exile. Russell saw this clearly. He wrote that the social penalty of disbelief often keeps people locked inside inherited convictions long after their intellect has begun to rebel. Belief, therefore, becomes a badge of belonging. 4. The seductive illusion of knowing. One of Russell's most radical moves was exposing a psychological flaw that philosophers had long ignored: the human craving for certainty. We are uncomfortable with ambiguity. We do not like maybe. We want the universe to be stable, moral, predictable, purposeful. Religion offers that sense of stability, and we cling to it. But certainty is often a psychological craving, not a reflection of reality. Russell believed that genuinely rational people must accept uncertainty as part of life, just as sailors accept unpredictable winds. A mind that refuses to live with doubt will always be vulnerable to comforting illusions. Philosophically, this insight is profound. Certainty is not the opposite of doubt, it is the enemy of honest inquiry. The mature mind is comfortable with what it does not know. 5. How institutions manufacture belief. Russell was not content to critique individual psychology, he went after institutions as well. Religion, like any organized system, requires stability and continuity. It cannot survive on personal experiences alone. It must formalize, codify, and enforce belief. Russell identified several mechanisms by which institutions strengthen their hold. 1. Authority. A system of priests, scholars, interpreters who define what is correct belief. 2. Ritual. Repetition strengthens memory. Ritual turns ideas into habits. 3. Fear. Warnings of punishment for skepticism, hell, excommunication, social shame. 4. Moral framing. Belief becomes part of being good, and doubt becomes morally suspicious. 5. Community enforcement. Faith is celebrated, disbelief is marginalized. These mechanisms are not always malicious. Most arise naturally in human groups, but they create an environment where belief becomes intertwined with obedience, identity, and stability. This makes questioning extremely difficult. Russell saw that institutional belief does not simply survive, it defends itself, evolves defenses, punishes threats. It becomes intellectually immune. 6. The problem of sacred assumptions. One of Russell's sharpest insights is that human beings don't merely believe propositions, they believe foundations. A foundation belief is one that becomes exempt from scrutiny. It is treated as self-evident. Examples: the universe has a purpose. Moral laws come from a higher authority. Life after death must exist. People rarely question these foundational assumptions. Instead, they discuss details within the framework, never daring to examine the framework itself. Russell's genius was precisely in examining these invisible assumptions. He believed that many religious arguments begin by assuming the very conclusions they aim to prove. In logic, this is called begging the question, using the destination as the starting point. For example, arguing that God must exist because humans desire purpose assumes purpose is built into the universe. Claiming morality requires God assumes moral truths cannot arise from human reason or social agreement. Once these assumptions are exposed, many arguments collapse. 7. The psychology of the faithful mind. Russell never wanted to mock believers. He knew that the human mind is naturally structured to seek meaning, pattern, and coherence. Religion thrives because it aligns beautifully with our cognitive tendencies. Let's outline a few. 1. Pattern recognition bias. Humans see patterns everywhere, even in randomness. Religion offers a grand cosmic pattern. 2. Agency detection. We tend to assume events have agents behind them. Lightning must be a will, misfortune must be punishment. 3. Storytelling instinct. We love narratives with morals, heroes, and villains. Religious texts deliver exactly that. 4. In-group loyalty. We are wired to defend our group. Religion becomes a group identity. 5. Mortality anxiety. Knowing we will die creates existential dread. Religion promises continuity and consolation. In other words, religion is perfectly adapted to the human cognitive ecosystem. Russell's challenge was: can we honor our human needs without surrendering critical thought? 8. Belief as a moral shield. One of Russell's most uncomfortable observations is that belief often functions as a moral shield. People cling to religious systems not only for comfort, but to avoid moral responsibility. If morality comes from external commandments, divinely mandated, then the individual is relieved of the burden of constructing and defending their own ethical system. One simply follows instructions. But this also creates moral hazards. A person may commit harmful acts feeling morally justified because the authority said so. History is full of such examples, from crusades to forced conversions to discrimination justified by scripture. Russell's position was not that religion always leads to harm, but that delegating morality to an external authority can be dangerous. True morality, he argued, must come from reason, empathy, and human experience, not from unquestioned dogmas. 9. The courage to doubt. Doubt is not the enemy of meaning, it is the birthplace of intellectual honesty. Russell believed that doubt requires courage, more courage than belief. Belief offers comfort, community, and simplicity. Doubt demands responsibility, introspection, and independence. But doubt also opens the door to genuine understanding. A mind willing to doubt can grow, change, question inherited errors, explore new possibilities, construct evidence-based understanding. Doubt is not destruction, it is reconstruction. 10. The rebirth of belief, a new foundation. In the end, Russell did not advocate for a world without belief. He advocated for a different kind of belief, one rooted in curiosity, humility, and evidence. This new kind of belief has three qualities. 1. Provisional, open to revision when new evidence emerges. 2. Empirical, grounded in observation, science, and rational inquiry. 3. Humane, focused on human well-being, not dogmatic authority. This is not a cold, nihilistic worldview. It is profoundly hopeful. It imagines a humanity that matures intellectually, one that seeks understanding rather than certainty, meaning rather than obedience, and truth rather than comfort. Russell wanted us to move from inherited belief to conscious belief. Conclusion: the mind unchained. Belief is powerful, profound, and deeply human. It shapes civilizations and personal destinies. But when belief becomes unquestionable, it becomes a cage, beautiful perhaps, but still a cage. Russell's invitation is simple but transformative. Let us understand how beliefs form so we can choose them rather than inherit them. A free mind is not one without beliefs. It is one whose beliefs arise from clarity, courage, and curiosity.